Hello and welcome. I'm so excited to welcome you all to Alta Live. My name is Beth Spotswood. I'm the digital editor of altajournal.com. Today, I am so excited to welcome you to a conversation with author Jane McGonigal. Her new book asks a question humanity has asked itself since the dawn of time. What does the future hold? And I think a question we all have. How can we handle it? Her new book, Imaginable, How to See the Future Coming and Feel Ready for Anything, Even Things That Seem Impossible Today. She is the director of games research and development at the Institute for the Future, a nonprofit research group in Palo Alto, California. And she currently teaches the course, How to Think Like a Futurist at Stanford. She's the lead instructor for the Institute for the Future series on Coursera platform. I hope I'm saying that right. And she lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Today, she's going to be in conversation with my brilliant colleague, Matt Haber. Matt is the newsletter editor here at Alta. They are going to chat for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to take as many questions of as many of your questions as we can. Before we begin, I just want to quickly introduce those of you who might not know us to Alta. Alta Journal is an award-winning quarterly focused on California and the West. We create this beautiful magazine. We're in the process of creating another one for you right now. We do weekly series like this. Alta Live happens every Wednesday. The California Book Club happens monthly. We have a fabulous website, altaonline.com. I hope you check out. You can join us as a digital member for as little as $3 a month or become a subscriber for $50 a year. And I will send links to all of that to everyone later this afternoon, along with a recording of this interview. Before I turn it over to Matt and Jane, I do want to ask where everyone is zooming in from today. I'm up in Novato, California. If the rest of our crowd could let us know where they are coming in from, it's always fun to see. And with that, Matt and Jane, thanks.
Thanks, Beth.
Thanks, Beth.
So Jane, thank you for joining us. I will preface this by saying that I do not have a very good future forecasting history. I was at the Macworld where Steve Jobs announced the iPhone. I didn't see the keynote, but I was there and I saw the phone behind the glass case and I said famously to my friends, no one's going to want that thing. And they've sold only approximately 20 billion of those phones. But you have a very good track record predicting the future. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how you came to write Imaginable?
Yeah, sure. So I actually came to future forecasting kind of sideways, like sort of sneaking up on it, not realizing what I was doing. I actually was working as a game developer, game designer after I finished a PhD in game psychology at UC Berkeley. And I was really interested in figuring out if maybe we could invent new kinds of games that allowed gamers to use their skills that they were developing in these virtual worlds, their creativity, their collaboration skills, their flexible mindsets. Could we use those skills in service of real world goals? You know, maybe tackle some real world challenges with all of those hundreds of millions, now billions of gamers. And in the course of trying to invent some kind of game that would connect those skills with the real world, I wound up partnering with an organization called the Institute for the Future. I did not know what future forecasting was or future thinking was, but I learned that there are people whose job it is to try to imagine what kinds of worlds we might wake up in someday. And they might be really exciting worlds, new technologies like the iPhone, or they might be really challenging worlds like pandemics or mass climate migrations. And I wound up essentially inventing this new game genre called massively multiplayer forecasting games, where we, as professional futurists, we do research to think about what kinds of futures we might wake up in. And then we just invite hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people to imagine what they would do, how they would feel, what changes they would make, how they would try to help others. And kind of famously, leading up to writing Imaginable, I ran a couple of these games with almost 30,000 participants, imagining how they would help others and adapt during a respiratory pandemic that started in China that was coinciding with supply chain disruptions, extreme heat and wildfires from climate change, and a misinformation, like catastrophic misinformation on social media about the pandemic. And this was in 2008 and 2010. We were imagining, and because as futurists, we always look 10 years in the future, the games were set in 2019 and 2020.
So you pulled this scenario out of your mind,
yeah,
and then you promptly picked the winning lottery numbers.
Yeah, I know. Wouldn't that be nice?
So one of the exercises in your book that you talk about is thinking about yourself in 10 years and trying to imagine what's going to be different for you and for the world. And you also suggest looking back at where you were 10 years ago. So I'm curious, I guess you sort of started answering it, but where were you 10 years ago, and could you have envisioned your career, your life, and kind of the world that you are inhabiting 10 years ago? Was it present in any form?
Yeah, what a cool question. The reason we look back 10 years is that we find in the futures community, there's a lot of resistance to imagining things that we feel are somehow inherently unimaginable. Like the change is too dramatic. I mean, right now in the United States, we're living through a potential change that many people would have said was unthinkable, the overturning Roe v. Wade. I mean, people didn't even want to think that this was really possible. If we want to be able to really, set aside our normalcy bias, to be willing to imagine things that seem too different, too strange, it helps to look backwards and see how much has changed and how quickly it changed and how surprised people may have been. So yeah, you can start with your own life and look back and be surprised. And I mean, certainly I have 7-year-old twin daughters, and not being a parent 10 years ago, I mean, like any parent, that's one of those black holes where it's like it's really almost imposter
The
to
truly
imagine.
Undiscovered country. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we can look at our own lived experiences. We can look at, where I live in California now, the weather is so different. We never, 10 years ago, I wasn't living through wildfire seasons where, the whole house is full with air filters and purifiers. And
an old neighbor of mine in San Francisco used to say that there was more fog 10 years ago. And he's like, the fog's gone.
It truly. And so, even though it's hard to think about climate change, I mean, a lot of what I ask people to think about, it's objectively can create anxiety or stress, or it's painful to think about. But if we start by looking backwards and acknowledging the change we've lived through and we've adapted to in some ways successfully, or we've overcome, or we can realize that things can change, but also that we can be adaptive and we can be resilient and we can help others. And so it does kind of go both ways.
So let's now jump ahead 10 years. And I wrote down from your book, you listed 6 things that we're going to be dealing with, and I'll just rattle them off real quick because I have them right here. Extreme heat and drought brought on by climate change, post-pandemic trauma, ours and the planet's, the radicalization of young people via social media and conspiracy, the widespread adoption of facial recognition technology, universal basic income in our cities, states, and governments, and how that will change our lives, and the reinvention of higher education to be hopefully more affordable and lifelong. So are these the key things that you think we're struggling with, or no?
Let's drill into it. Okay. So those are my 6 future forces at the start of 2021. So every year I have a personal practice. I do this with my family. And we just think about what are the 6, we call them future forces or drivers of change. These are large external forces, bigger than us, bigger than any company or community, that we believe are likely to impact our lives, our families' lives, our communities' lives in the next decade. And I picked those 6 partly because I have 7-year-old, kids, and I'm worried about the cohort that they'll grow up with, the kids that they'll grow up with. I do worry about their peers being radicalized. I worry about their friends, the relationships they might have. So I do think about, because I have 7-year-old kids. If you didn't have kids, you might be, and I'm thinking about higher education, because in 10 years, they would be applying to college. If traditional college is still a thing, or if applications still exist. Maybe it'll be reinvented. Maybe we'll rethink how we learn or what we're learning in
And
service
hopefully
of.
right-sized in terms of price. That would be
Well,
helpful
I
to a lot of
mean,
parents in the world.
yeah. And so one of the processes, activities that I lead people through in the chapter on future forces is to find your own future forces. And at the end of the chapter, there's actually a bigger list. There's like 50 or 60 possible future forces that different people might feel personally, called by, excited about, worried about. And so just sharing your 5 or 6 future forces, I find it an incredible way to understand people's hopes and worries. I have universal basic income on mine because I believe that is one of the most kind of impactful solutions at all levels for mental health, for physical health, for climate health, economic health.
And probably was inconceivable 10 years ago to most people that something like that could happen. And some cities are piloting it.
Right. I mean, I think it was 2013 that I joined an action group on universal basic income. I'd never heard about it. There's actually a story that we cut from the final version of the book because we wanted to make it
to us now
a little snappier. Yeah. I mean, one of the things as a futurist we always say is you never know what. I mean, it's actually an old Zen saying. You never know what the consequences of what seem like good fortune might be, like the misfortune that might come. You never know what the positive impacts of what seems like misfortune might be. There's all these twists and turns. And so we try to balance what we call positive and shadow imagination. Can you imagine how this might lead to something good? Can you imagine what new risks or harms might evolve? And the universal basic income movement, it got dramatically reboosted after sort of dying in the 70s by investors, VCs in Silicon Valley, who were worried about the possible long-term consequences of the technologies they were investing in, namely automation. And what happens if we have less human work to do in the coming decades? And they were actually trying to think in a long-term, what would be beneficial for humanity way. If we think this technology is the right thing to develop, how can we look at others, maybe social policy, economic policy, so we don't kind of fall off a work cliff or an employment cliff without a safety net? And that was really interesting to watch as a futurist unfold over the past decade, because the technology folks were kind of like the bad guys of the future of work. They were supposed to be the villains who were going to get rid of all the jobs. And suddenly they were championing this progressive ideology. They were investing, they were funding pilot studies of UBI. And to me, having lived through that, it really helped me, it restored my confidence that we don't know, we can't say for sure that this technology will have good or bad outcomes. We can't say these actors, are going to be in service of this goal. There's so much potential to change and twists and turns, which is nice because it means if we can't say for sure what the outcome will be, we can affect it, which is, Imaginal is all about how do we not just predict the future, but can we impact it so we actually wake up in a world that we want.
You also talk in the book about the kind of flip side of imaginable, which is this term that you say has been used millions of times in the last couple of years, which is unimaginable.
Yeah.
And I wonder, is there an agenda in using unimaginable? Like, does it kind of lock the story or make it so that people can't open their minds by just calling something unimaginable and leaving it at that?
I mean, there was definitely like a fire lit in my pants early in 2020 when I started tracking use of this word unimaginable and unthinkable. And it turns out over the past 2 years, Unthinkable appeared in Unimaginable appeared in 2.5 million English language news stories, and Unthinkable appeared in over 3 million. And early on, it was being used almost like, an excuse. Like previously unimaginable changes, previously unthinkable.
Right, it's almost like the experts saying, "Don't look at us. We couldn't even conceive of this."
Yeah, when in fact the experts, really did conceive of a lot of this. It was the refusal to take it seriously. It was the absence of opportunity, I think, for ordinary people to really think through and imagine, how would I feel and adapt before it happens. Because when sudden change happens, when a crisis hits, if we haven't prepared our imagination for it, we feel shock, we freeze, we deny. And I mean, that's what most people spent a good part of 2020, either denying or freezing, and feeling that shock. So I think it would be better if we could confidently say, for a much wider range of possibilities, there is no future that is, no future crisis that's unthinkable just because we refuse to think about it. Or on the flip side, there's no positive transformation like UBI. Like, it's not unimaginable. We believe it is possible, and we can find proof, and we can believe in that change and be a part of it. Because I think that it's all, those words are also used to, I don't know, demotivate people. Like, don't even bother. Canceling student debt, like whatever it is, like
it's never going to change. So why bother?
Yes, but we keep thinking it, keep imagining it. You might change some minds.
Yeah, and I think just saying something is imaginable is like you've named it, and you're able to kind of have some small feeling of empowerment or ownership towards it, which is what kind of one of the themes of the book is, like, just by thinking about these things, you're able to begin to get a grasp of it.
Yeah. And I mean, as long as we're like, I would love to just be like very concrete about it, since we're talking about UBI. One of the reasons why I ask people to imagine futures in these very personal ways, what would you feel? What would you do? Is that when we try to imagine new policies or dramatic changes in society, we often either we kind of get told what to think. Oh, that's a conservative idea. Don't endorse that. Or, oh, that's liberal. We don't want that. Or we have the kind of abstract sense, like giving people money for free, it's just wrong. Like that's against my values. But if you ask people to imagine just for themselves what they would do, and to ask friends and family, well, what would you do? And when I first started trying to do forecasting around UBI, I just asked people, imagine you're getting $1,000 a month. It's check in the mail, and it comes with a thank you message. You did something to deserve it. Somebody's thanking you, and they're going to thank you every month forever. And also your mom's getting thanked, and your spouse is getting thanked, and your kids are getting thanked. What do you do with that first check? Where does that money go? Okay, next one. Where does that money go? And when people actually imagine the impact on their own lives, or they talk to people they know about the impact, we can kind of get outside of all the divisive abstract debate or politicized debate, and really see from all these points of views what the real impacts or real consequences might be, the lived consequences. And people often change their mind or opinion when they have a firsthand, foresight of how it would affect them, rather than just these, I don't know, instead of arguing about it, imagining it may be more helpful.
Yeah. So I'm curious about your job and what, in terms of being a futurist, is like when you go to parties, or when you write your job title on your tax forms or whatever. What do people think you do all day? Do they think you're just like lying there with your eyes closed, just dreaming? Or what do they imagine your career is like?
I mean, I think that one misconception people have about futurists is that we're mostly concerned with making accurate predictions. So when I teach how to think like a futurist, I always start by saying the number one rule of future thinking is we never, ever, 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 ever try to accurately predict the future. Because if you're trying to be right about the future, that means you look around today, and you can look for evidence and data and trends and what you think is most probable. But if the future that you believe is most probable is not the future you want, it's not the best possible future, it's a future you'd rather avoid. If you're just trying to be right, then what are you going to do? You're just like sit around and wait for it to happen and be like, well, I told you so. I mean, we would rather, I think, prove ourselves wrong, and wake up in a future that was better than, seemed predictable at the time, which is why there's a focus, in my work, when people ask me like, oh, tell me what's going to happen with the metaverse. That's the new question now. But people also, I always say like, well, it's not what will happen, right? It's what do we want to happen? And we look for these opportunities to make the future. And I think it's a great time to be thinking about digital currencies or virtual realities or new kinds of economic policies, because there's so much opportunity now before the norms are settled,
Mhm.
before the laws are written, before,
And
culture
before
is
people with
created.
agendas actually begin to act and do things. Like now is the chance to kind of imagine all kinds of approaches and scenarios.
Right. And the more people who get involved, then we may discover, I mean, just like playing a game, if the day that a new video game is released, nobody knows how to play it,
Mhm.
right? And everybody comes together on wikis and streaming on Twitch, and they're trying to figure out, how does this game work? What are the opportunities? What are the cool like tricks? And they play together to discover like every possible
Mhm.
outcome in the game. And they construct that collective intelligence together. And if we have, more people really looking at these possible futures and really trying to figure out, what are the outlier possibilities, or what's the best case, epic win scenarios, we can build that collective intelligence
Mhm.
about the future as well.
Do you still get to play your recommended hours of gaming per week? I know that you
Uh,
recommended how many hours per week?
well, an hour
Collectively,
a
like
day.
21 billion, right?
21 billion. Yeah, we're not that far off now.
Well,
Because when I first started tracking,
because of Wordle and all these other games.
oh yeah, it's so funny. Like right now, my gaming habit is in the morning. One of my daughters comes and snuggles with me in bed before we get dressed for school and at breakfast, and we play Wordle. And in the evening, my other daughter comes and snuggles, and we play Quordle, which is the harder version. We have to do 4 at the same
wow.
time. So it's like very challenging. But like it's almost like, I don't know, having a cup of tea or like
Well, it
it's
just turns your
become a
brain
family
on.
tradition. Yeah, and the fact that it's social, and it's this kind of soothing ritual that I can count on.
Did you get your other hours into?
I mean, that's pretty much it for me right now, except I'm running future forecasting games for the Institute for the Future.
Are there any that you can tell us about, or are they?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Secret?
Oh no, of course.
Okay.
Well, the big one for this year where, so at the end of Imaginable, it's basically like a DIY game. Like if you wanted to tabletop your own future simulation, you can get the book and read about scenarios and here's how to play and invite people. And at the Institute for the Future, we're going to be playing one of the scenarios in the book with thousands of people later this year. So if folks want to play with others and not just with, their friends or family, they can do that. And the scenario is looking at how we might make decisions about geoengineering technologies. So let's say we decide we need to take more dramatic climate action while we try to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, become zero waste, 100% clean energy. If that's going to take another 10, 20, 30 years, maybe we need to do something more dramatic in the meantime, like solar radiation management, sending sulfate particles into the atmosphere that mimic the effects of a volcano. When it explodes, the dust and the ash, it kind of cools the planet. We've seen that historically in the climate past. So there are a lot of scientists who think it would be really good for the planet to do a little intentional solar radiation management just to cool off the planet. I mean, look at what's happening in India and Pakistan right now. A billion people right now are living through. They're just at that point where it is literally, the scientific term is incompatible with human life. It's too hot. People will die. 1 billion people now. If we need to cool the planet, we might have to do this. But the technology is never been used, never been tried, might have unintended consequences, might have unequal impacts. There might be more flooding in some regions, food insecurity. So the game is about trying to figure out how could we equitably and safely move forward with such a, it's a leap of faith that we may need to take. And it's looking at future of democracy. How would you conduct a global vote in countries that have no tradition of democratic voting or democratic systems? Would you let kids vote? How would we communicate scientific information? We've seen how hard it is to communicate the science of the pandemic.
Sure.
What are new, hopeful methods for building trust in science or a shared reality around a really important, difficult scientific topic? So that's what we're going to be playing with.
So I guess in 10 years, we'll see if this actually comes, and we'll say, you did it again.
Well, I'll tell you, no. We won't do it. You'll see it every day now going forward. I mean, this is my favorite thing about playing future forecasting games. Once you've played with a game or you've read the scenarios in the book, it plants the seed in your mind and it actually changes your brain. So it makes certain topics and certain information more attractive to your brain, and you're more likely to notice it and follow up on it and dig deeper on it, advocate for others. Because you can imagine it, and you literally get dopamine hits. You know how we're all like, we're so stressed out, like I'm addicted to my phone, I'm addicted to social media, to games, and everybody's worried about dopamine and how it controls us. Well, you can use dopamine to your benefit just by imagining the scenarios now. Your brain will get a little dopamine hit every time you notice information in the real world that explains how this scenario, might become more likely or more plausible. And I mean, literally, for the Imaginable came out in March. My inbox is full of people now sending me links to news stories and social media saying, oh my God, I just saw here in DC, we have the tick now that gives the meat allergy, that there's a scenario in the book about the next pandemic is, people, you start to see it. And then it doesn't take 10 years, right, for you to feel empowered and informed and capable and ready. It actually changes who you are going forward, that's my favorite side effect of these games is people it's easier to pay attention to what's happening. You are not going to be blindsided. You're going to see, that's where the title comes from. You're going to see it coming because your brain will literally pick up these clues now.
Well, I know what's coming next, which is Beth coming back on and giving us some questions from the audience. But thank you so much, Jane. This has been an awesome conversation. Now it's time for the audience to ask some questions.
I'm still marinating in what my life was like 10 years ago and what it could be like for those of us with children under 10. It's just insane. Anyway, this is incredible. And we have a ton of questions. The first one, Christy asked, which is exactly my question. What is your go-to way of preparing for the future that has to do with the psychology and self-care so we are not panicking, so that we have agency?
Yeah. Okay. So there's something called micro actions that I write about in the book. And a micro action is something you can do in 5 minutes with literally no obstacles in your way. It's like the smallest possible step you can imagine taking to feel more ready for a future that you have imagined or for a change that you've started informing yourself about. So, one of the technologies I write about in the book is facial recognition technology. Let's say you want to, you like this technology, it feels invasive, it feels dystopian, like, what am I going to do for this future? You could go online and watch a 2-minute YouTube video showing you how to apply makeup so that it actually interferes with the technology's ability to recognize your face. So there's actually, just something you could do. You could go put on a little makeup so that you are now undetectable to facial recognition systems. You might not need to wear it now, but hey, if that future rolls around and the technology is pervasive and you don't want to be a part of it, you have a tool or a tip. And we have a community at the Institute for the Future where you can come and ask people for ideas for micro actions if you don't have any of your own. It's called Urgent Optimus. And I think it's literally just do something, do anything, 5 minutes, and you'll start to feel just a little more confident, a little more capable. And then that, like we were just saying, it becomes contagious. It builds over time. You start to pay attention to things and you actually become someone who is better prepared. But it does help if you're willing to take 5 minutes to just learn a little more, feel a little more, confident in your understanding of this topic or your capabilities in this area. 5 minutes. Once a week, I do it, 5 minutes.
So for example, if you are visualizing something like an imaginable scenario like the big earthquake that those of us on the West Coast are anticipating, that is bound to happen, is guaranteed to happen, you're kind of saying you could do something like prepare, take 5 minutes and learn about earthquake preparedness, pack your go bag, figure out, make sure you're safe, teach your kids how to stay safe in an earthquake. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. I mean, for me, earthquake's an interesting one. We'll see what happens with earthquakes. I feel like earthquakes is actually it's like we're like more prepared for earthquakes in some ways than any of these other futures. Like people do generally understand what they're supposed to do. And I think when it comes to earthquakes, and I do think, part of feeling ready for anything is exposing yourself to ideas or topics that maybe you haven't been exposed to before, that you're not finding familiar. So in Imaginable, there's all these like search terms and clues like, hey, if you haven't heard about this, just go Google it. Just put one bit of data in your mind. Because when I mean, earthquakes have been happening for, as long as the planet has existed. There are new things also that we can be ready for. I will say, I'll give one tip about earthquakes that a lot of people may not be aware of, that is useful for other kinds of future scenarios that I think are coming, which is that you can put an app on your phone now that will help you rebuild the internet if there's a crisis like an earthquake or some other situation where the internet gets shut down for cybersecurity reasons. You can make your own internet where it's like a mesh network where your phone connects to a phone that's maybe next door, their phone connects to a phone that's next door, and through Bluetooth, you can rebuild a local internet. It could grow, right? People are using this technology when the government is shutting down the internet for, political reasons or authoritarian reasons in India and other parts of the world. But if you want to be ready for an earthquake, I would say you should have a mesh network app on your phone. Take 5 minutes today after watching this video, search in the App Store for mesh network and put it on your phone so that you're ready. And then tell your neighbors, if you get a chance, or tell somebody else near you, because it'll work better if there's a higher density of phones.
You can keep doing Wordle if you have it.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be the worst earthquake in human history, but you'll be able to access.
But you'll get that score.
Wordle and Twitter.
But they'll still use the word forego. Oh, so mad about last week. That's great. Well, we all have an action item. Okay, along those lines of the internet getting shut down and what have you, Robert is reading a book about the Civil War, how civil wars start. And as a history professor, he's been worried about a United States Civil War, another one, with the extremism, conspiracy theories, and denial of accurate election results.
Yeah.
What do you see ahead for our republic?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I will say what I specialize in are imagining some of the more challenging futures so that whatever we actually face, maybe doesn't seem so bad by comparison. So this is not a prediction, but it's something, it's a scenario that I'm developing now at the Institute to help us play with what strategies would we try to use if we woke up in this world. And I do think, so we're imagining essentially a kind of forking of democracy in the United States that is similar to how blockchain technology is being forked today. So, say you're on a blockchain like Bitcoin and there's a disputed transaction, you can't undo the transaction. It's irreversible. So you'll see half of the people on the chain will say, well, fine, we're going to go create our own alternate reality version of it where this had never happened. And they just fork, and then they live in two different worlds, and they just don't accept that the other, side of the blockchain's reality is legitimate. I absolutely think we could see essentially a forked democracy where certain states are following certain laws and enacting certain policies. And it's not a war. I mean, that's the good news. It's not a bloody battle. It's just literally forking the democracy and saying, we don't accept those results as valid. So therefore we are going to live as if these results are valid and we're going to follow these rules. And I mean, yeah, it is not inconceivable to imagine essentially a bloodless civil war that is based only forged through, I guess, what we accept as reality. If you're interested,
Job is so fun.
Oh, I know. But if you're interested in this
like,
topic, go learn about how forking works on blockchains. This would be my advice.
Okay.
Because it provides it provides a model for how this might happen that is different from the idea of like people picking up, guns and
Right.
a more realistic model. So if you're interested in the future of democracy, I'd say go learn about how blockchains essentially govern themselves, and look up forking and blockchains. And then that, I think, will. Now, what should we do about it? I mean, how would you talk to a loved one that was living on the other, forked side of reality? I mean, these are things
Some of us are already doing that.
Yeah.
That's actually, Jack points out in the comments that happens in religion, which is.
Oh, yes. It happening again now, I believe. We're seeing that happen. Right. Yes. And I mean, I always say, look, we try to balance positive and shadow imagination. As I'm playing with this scenario, there is a part of me that wants to consider, are there any positive outcomes to this? I mean, religions splitting, that as a model is an interesting one, to think about. How do we allow change to happen in a country that has a certain history and a certain territory? Are there ways to allow that to change that don't involve war or secession? I mean, there may be seeds of innovation, of democratic innovation, even in imagining what sounds like a totally apocalyptic dystopian future. Maybe there is a way for us to allow nation states to change and transform without war, without secession. So all these ideas sound like very hard, challenging, but they can also be inspiring and kind of allow us to think more creatively about what's possible.
Okay, we're getting close to time, but I want to squeeze in a few more questions. Amy asked, do you get together with other futurists and compare notes? Or alternately, when you get together with futurists, do you discuss anything but the future? The Real Housewives of Orange County, or, whatever.
I mean, well, first of all, I'll say, so at the Institute for the Future, we have about 30 researchers. And so we're constantly comparing notes, and everybody has their own areas of specialty or expertise. And we do get into debates, like how realistic is this forecast, or you have such a rosy view of this policy or technology, here's another view of it. So that's just like constant practice. There's the first sort of mantra I learned when I trained as a futurist was strong opinions lightly held. So you're supposed to really expose yourself to counter opinions, evidence that might challenge, your own beliefs or assumptions about what the future will be. So that sort of bouncing and friction, it's very much important that you not get stuck thinking that, a certain future is definitely possible or definitely likely or definitely good or bad. What else do futurists talk about? I mean, futurists talk about politics because, of course, like the area where we can see the most radical change or dramatic change the fastest is often around politics and geopolitics, and things can change faster there. We often say like the future happens in kind of these 10-year timelines, but with some things it can, like war, right? The future can happen overnight.
When you're planting all of these seeds of like knowledge, do you ever find it necessary to self-care by kind of turning it off? Do you read, romance novels or find, what's your outlet in terms of taking a break from the thinking of the future and imagining what our road is? How do you give yourself a rest?
I mean, well, so actually the most practical thing I do when I'm feeling overwhelmed by future topics is I go to Google and I type in, what I wish were true or what would make me feel more hopeful, and see if I can find any evidence or clues.
Give us an example, please.
So, I mean, norovirus vaccines, for example, like something that I would be interested to know if 10 years from now, that's something just we're not going to worry about anymore. I know a lot of people who like have intense phobia around that. Like, what would it be like if it's just that were a fear that could be gone forever? And then you type it in and wow, somebody just filed, they're doing a new clinical trial. So partly you just have to purposefully expose yourself to things. And in Imaginable, there's a list of search terms, positive step forward, good news, innovative solution. And then you just put that alongside whatever you're worried about, climate change, women's equality, whatever it is, manifest, into your awareness, all of the helpers who are solving the problems, all of the positive breakthroughs in science and technology, the new policy, the social movements. So, yes, of course I watch Netflix and all of that stuff, but the thing that actually helps me the most is going on these essentially like scavenger hunts for positive signals of change, so that I'm actually, at the end of the day, more optimistic. Even if you're bravely acknowledging the challenges we face, there's so many people in the world working on solutions and ideas and movements and actions, and it just feels good to bring that into our awareness.
I love starting a Google search with the term good news and then whatever you want to Google.
Yeah.
Love it. Last question. I'm going to kind of combine two. Can you recommend any books, Reddit groups, Twitter feeds, blogs about future thinking?
Yeah. Oh, wait, the main thing is the Institute for the Future has a newsletter, a free newsletter, News from the Future. So you can come to iftf.org and check it out. Also, Urgent Optimus is our public program. We have a monthly scenario club. We have monthly Signals of Hope scavenger hunts, where this past month, we found 100 signals of climate hope from every region of the world. So Urgent Optimus is, if you want to, there's courses you can take with me. I teach different imagination training techniques. And I would say those are two good places to start after you've read the book.
And we have a link to the book in the chat. Also, folks, we're going to have links to all of this, the newsletter, the groups that Jane mentioned, and we'll email that to you, as well as a recording of this interview later this afternoon. It will be posted on altaonline.com as well. Before I thank our interviewer and our guest, I'd like to invite everyone to Alta Live next week, where we will be interviewing world-renowned adventure photographer Gordon Wiltsey, who on his latest for Alta photographed the wild boars of California and is still cleaning off his camera. So please join us for that on May 11th at 12:30 right here at Alta Live. Matt, thank you so much. And Jane McGonigal, author of Imaginable. It's been an absolute mind-blowing treat to have you. You're fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for joining, everyone. Take care.